Isabella of Valois became Queen of England as a teenager and immediately refused to follow English court customs of removing body hair from her legs, groin, and armpits, which she considered barbaric and humiliating compared to French practices. Over months and years, her pubic hair and underarm hair grew long and matted, trapping sweat, dirt, menstrual blood, and fecal matter that created perfect breeding grounds for lice infestations so severe that her skin developed open sores from constant scratching. The smell became so overwhelming that King Richard II stopped entering her chambers entirely, and English diplomats complained they could not present such a queen to European courts because the odor and visible parasites made her unfit for public appearances. Isabella of Valois arrived in England in 1396 when she was just 7 years old, betrothed to King Richard II as part of a peace treaty between England and France that was supposed to end decades of warfare between the two kingdoms. She was too young to actually consummate the marriage, which would not happen until she reached puberty several years later, but she was old enough to be brought to the English court and begin her education as the future Queen of England, learning English customs and expectations that would govern her adult life. The problem that would eventually destroy her position at court started almost immediately, rooted in a fundamental clash between French and English ideas about proper feminine hygiene and grooming that went far deeper than just personal preference and touched on issues of national identity and cultural superiority that were impossible to compromise on without feeling like you were betraying your entire heritage. In France, particularly among the nobility, women did not routinely remove body hair from their legs, armpits, or pubic regions, considering this practice unnecessary and even somewhat vulgar, something that prostitutes might do to appeal to clients but that respectable women avoided because their body hair was natural and removing it suggested an unhealthy preoccupation with physical appearance that was beneath the dignity of someone of noble birth. English court fashion, however, had different standards that had been developing over the previous century, influenced partly by earlier contact with Middle Eastern grooming practices through the Crusades and partly by English ideas about what separated civilized nobility from unwashed peasants. English noblewomen were expected to maintain smooth hairless skin on their legs and underarms through regular shaving or the use of primitive depilatory pastes, and to carefully trim or remove most pubic hair to prevent the accumulation of odors and parasites that could develop in the warm moist environment of the genital area where hair could trap sweat and biological waste. These grooming practices were considered essential markers of civilization and refinement, distinguishing noble women who had the time and resources to maintain their bodies properly from peasants who could not afford the tools or the time for such maintenance and who therefore lived with body hair that became dirty and infested. When Isabel reached her early teenage years and her body began developing adult characteristics including significant growth of body hair in all the typical locations, legs, armpits, and pubic region, her French attendants who had accompanied her from Paris made it clear that she should maintain French customs rather than adopting English ones, telling her that shaving or trimming her body hair would be degrading herself to please barbarians who did not understand proper French refinement and who were trying to force foreign customs on a French princess. Isabel, young and homesick and clinging to her French identity as the only stable thing in her life at the English court where everything else was foreign and unfamiliar, took this advice seriously and refused all suggestions from English ladies that she should begin the grooming practices expected of an English queen. At first this was just a minor eccentricity that people at court noted but did not consider particularly important, because Isabel was still very young and had not yet taken on the full responsibilities and public visibility of her position, and there was some expectation that she would gradually adopt English customs as she matured and became more integrated into court life. But as she grew older and the marriage was consummated and she became Queen of England in fact rather than just in title, her refusal to follow English grooming standards became increasingly problematic for everyone around her, and what had seemed like youthful stubbornness began to look like deliberate rejection of English culture that had political implications beyond just personal grooming choices. As Isabel progressed through her teenage years without ever removing or even properly maintaining the body hair that grew increasingly thick and long on her legs, in her armpits, and especially in her pubic region, the predictable consequences of this neglect began manifesting in ways that affected not just her personal comfort but her ability to function as Queen of England and her relationships with everyone around her. The hair on her legs grew to several inches in length and became coarse and tangled, particularly behind her knees and on her thighs where the constant friction from walking and sitting would cause it to mat together with the sweat and dead skin cells that accumulated from wearing the heavy layered dresses required by court fashion, creating clumps of hair that pulled painfully when she moved and that collected dirt and debris that was never properly cleaned out because washing legs thoroughly through thick matted hair was nearly impossible. Her underarm hair grew equally long and problematic, reaching lengths of 3 or 4 inches and becoming so dense that it trapped the sweat that poured from her armpits during hot weather or physical exertion, and this constant moisture combined with the lack of air circulation under the tight sleeves and multiple layers of her court dresses created conditions perfect for bacterial growth that produced an increasingly strong odor of stale sweat mixed with something more organic and unpleasant that people near her could smell even through the layers of fabric and the perfumes her ladies tried desperately to mask it with. But the worst problems by far developed in her pubic region, were the combination of the warm moist environment, the biological realities of menstruation and urination and defecation, and the sanitation practices of the medieval era came together to create a genuine health crisis that was as much medical as it was social and political. The pubic hair that Isabel refused to trim or remove grew to remarkable lengths, reportedly reaching 4 or 5 inches in some areas, and became so matted and tangled that it formed essentially solid masses of hair that trapped everything that came into contact with it and that could not be properly cleaned without cutting through the tangles, which Isabel absolutely refused to allow. Menstrual blood would flow into this mass of hair during her monthly cycles and dry there, crusting into the tangled strands and creating dark stiff sections that pulled at her skin and that accumulated month after month because they could not be washed out properly. Small amounts of urine would splash or drip into the pubic hair during urination because the thick mat of hair made it impossible for her to adequately spread herself or position herself properly, and this urine would also dry into the hair and add to the general accumulation of biological waste. Perhaps most disturbing were the traces of fecal matter that transferred from her anus to the surrounding pubic hair during the wiping process after defecation, because medieval toilet paper was crude and ineffective and the proximity of anus to vulva meant that contamination was almost inevitable, especially with several inches of matted pubic hair creating additional surfaces for fecal matter to stick to and accumulate on. This accumulation of menstrual blood, urine, fecal matter, sweat, and dead skin cells created a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites that began colonizing her pubic hair in numbers that would have been controlled by regular washing and grooming but that exploded into serious infestation because Isabel's refusal to trim her pubic hair made proper cleaning essentially impossible even if she had been willing to try. Lice found the long matted pubic hair to be perfect habitat, with the insects feeding on her blood and laying eggs that hatched into new generations of parasites that spread through the tangled hair and onto her skin, causing intense itching that led Isabel to scratch constantly, digging her nails into her genital area trying to reach the insects that were biting her, breaking the skin and creating small wounds that would become infected and add to the general inflammatory misery of her pubic region. The scratching and the infections created areas of raw irritated skin that wept fluid continuously, and this discharge added to the moisture trapped in her pubic hair, making the whole situation progressively worse as the cycle of infestation, scratching, infection, and further infestation continued without any effective intervention. The odor that developed from Isabel's unwashed and parasite-infested body hair was not something that could be hidden or ignored, despite the best efforts of her remaining French attendants who tried desperately to mask it with perfumes and incense and frequent changes of her outer garments that touched the areas where the smell originated. The smell came from multiple sources that combined into something genuinely overwhelming to anyone who came near her, The bacterial decomposition of trapped sweat and dead skin in her leg and underarm hair produced a sour, stale odor like old laundry that had been left damp too long. The rotting of menstrual blood and other biological materials trapped in her pubic hair created a sweet, sick smell of decay. The waste products of the lice feeding on her blood and reproducing in her body hair added their own distinctive insect smell, and the infected sores on her skin where she had scratched too hard and broken through to create wounds were constantly oozing pus that had its own particular odor of infection. People who came near Isabel could smell her from several feet away even when she was fully dressed, perceiving a thick, unpleasant odor that suggested unclean genitals and unwashed bodies and something organic that was slowly rotting, and this smell would cling to furniture and fabrics wherever she sat or stood for any length of time, making her presence impossible to ignore or forget even hours after she had left a room. Servants would have to air out any chamber where she had spent time, opening windows and burning incense to clear the smell before anyone else could comfortably occupy the space. King Richard, who had married Isabel for political reasons when she was a child and who had eventually consummated the marriage when she reached puberty but who was by some historical accounts more interested in his male favorites than in his wife anyway, used the smell as a convenient and unarguable excuse to avoid her chambers almost entirely, claiming that the odor made him physically ill and gave him headaches, and that he could not be expected to share a bed with someone whose body produced such overwhelming stench. The marital relationship, which had never been particularly warm or close even before the hygiene problems became severe, essentially ceased to exist as Richard stopped visiting Isabel for the conjugal relations that were supposed to be part of their marriage and that were politically important for producing heirs to secure the succession and strengthen the alliance between England and France. Isabel's ladies-in-waiting, particularly the English women who had been assigned to serve her as part of integrating her into English court life and who had initially tried to be sympathetic to her difficult position as a foreign princess, began requesting transfers to other positions because they could not stand being in close proximity to her for the hours each day that their duties required, and because the smell would transfer to their own clothing and hair and make them unwelcome in the quarters of other courtiers who could smell that they had been near the Queen. The process of helping Isabel dress and undress, which required touching her body and being very close to the sources of the smell including her unwashed pubic region when helping her with undergarments, became something that servants drew straws to avoid, and several of her attendants actually quit royal service entirely rather than continue serving a queen whose personal hygiene had deteriorated to the point where touching her was genuinely unpleasant and where the smell would make them social pariahs among other court servants. The French attendants who had encouraged her to maintain French customs and who had supported her refusal to adopt English grooming practices now found themselves trapped by their own advice, unable to suggest that maybe she should reconsider her position without admitting they had been wrong and without seeming to betray French cultural pride, and unable to effectively clean or care for her because she would not allow them to cut the matted hair that was the source of all the problems and without which proper cleaning was essentially impossible. The situation created a bizarre stalemate where everyone involved knew exactly what needed to be done to solve the problem but no one could actually do it because Isabel had made her refusal to shave or trim her body hair into a matter of personal and national pride, insisting that maintaining her French customs was more important than accommodating English barbarians who did not understand proper feminine dignity, even though her understanding of French customs was actually being contradicted by reports from France where noble women also practiced some degree of body hair maintenance even if not to the same extent as English women. What had started as a personal grooming disagreement evolved into a genuine political problem that affected England's diplomatic standing and created tensions that threatened the peace treaty Isabel's marriage was supposed to secure, as her condition made it increasingly difficult for England to fulfill the diplomatic and ceremonial functions that required the Queen's presence and participation according to established protocol. Foreign ambassadors who came to the English court for formal receptions and treaty negotiations expected to be presented to both the King and Queen according to proper diplomatic protocol that had been established over centuries, But Richard began making increasingly awkward excuses for why Isabel could not attend these important events, claiming she was ill or indisposed or needed to rest, when the real reason was that presenting her would be genuinely embarrassing for England because the smell would be immediately noticeable to these important visitors, and because the visible evidence of parasites moving in her hair and the scratching she could not stop herself from doing would be observed and commented on and reported back to their home courts as evidence that the English royal family was not maintaining proper standards. English nobles who should have been proud to serve their queen and who should have viewed her as a symbol of the successful alliance with France instead complained privately and sometimes semi-publicly about the disgrace of having a monarch who could not maintain basic hygiene that any peasant woman managed without difficulty, with some calling her more beast than woman and suggesting that her behavior proved French people were fundamentally uncivilized despite all their claims of cultural superiority over the supposedly barbaric English. The split at court between those who supported Isabel out of loyalty to the French alliance or sympathy for her difficult position as a foreign princess who had been married off as a child, and those who thought she was a disgrace who should be forced to comply with English standards regardless of her French identity or her personal feelings about the matter, created factional tensions that affected other political matters and made governing more difficult than it needed to be because every issue became entangled with the question of whose side you were on regarding the Queen's hygiene. Diplomatic correspondence from this period includes remarkably frank complaints from English officials about the impossibility of presenting Isabel to European courts in her current condition, with some letters explicitly mentioning the smell and the parasites that were visible in her hair and asking for advice about how to handle a queen who refused to meet minimum standards of hygiene expected of someone in her position regardless of cultural differences. The French court, when they learned about the situation through their own diplomatic channels and through letters from Isabel's French attendants, was equally horrified but for completely different reasons. Seeing Isabel's condition not as a failure on her part to adopt English customs but as evidence that the English were not taking proper care of their French princess and were allowing her to deteriorate through neglect and possibly through deliberate mistreatment designed to humiliate France. This created diplomatic tensions between England and France that threatened the peace treaty that Isabel's marriage had been meant to secure, with French officials suggesting that if England could not properly care for a French princess then perhaps the marriage should be annulled and Isabel returned to France where she would receive the proper treatment and respect that her position deserved, though this was complicated by the fact that bringing her back to France in her current condition would itself be embarrassing for the French royal family. The nails on Isabel's hands and feet, which she also refused to cut because she viewed this as part of the same English obsession with unnatural grooming that demanded shaving body hair and that she rejected as incompatible with proper French dignity, had grown long enough to begin curving and becoming discolored, collecting dirt underneath that could be seen from several feet away and occasionally breaking in ways that left jagged edges that would catch on fabric and sometimes draw blood when they snagged. Her hands, which should have been a queen's most visible and carefully maintained feature during public appearances where she would gesture gracefully and be observed by crowds of subjects and foreign visitors, instead looked like something from a person who worked outdoors doing manual labor, with long yellowed nails that had dirt visibly packed underneath them, and this made even her supporters at court wince when they noticed them and had to try to maintain the fiction that she was a proper queen deserving of respect and reverence. Isabella of Valois died in 1409 when she was just 20 years old, officially from complications of childbirth after delivering a daughter, though contemporary accounts and medical analysis of the limited records that survive suggest her general health had been severely compromised by years of poor hygiene that had weakened her immune system and made her vulnerable to the kind of infections that a healthier person with better baseline health might have been able to survive. Her brief life had been defined almost entirely by a stubborn refusal to compromise on what she saw as fundamental matters of personal dignity and national identity, maintaining her French grooming practices and her rejection of English customs even as they progressively destroyed her health, her marriage, her reputation, and her ability to function effectively as Queen of England in ways that should have been obvious to anyone observing the consequences. The irony that modern historians note when studying her case is that her stance, which she framed as refusing to submit to English barbarism and as maintaining her French cultural pride in hostile foreign territory, actually made her life far more miserable and more degrading than it would have been if she had simply adopted the grooming practices that would have prevented the parasites, prevented the infections, prevented the smell, and prevented all the social and political consequences that flowed inevitably from those physical problems. Her body at death showed the effects of years of self-neglect that had been framed as cultural pride, the extensive scarring from untreated infections in her pubic region where the constant scratching and the bacterial growth in the infected sores had left permanent marks, the damaged and discolored skin on her legs and underarms where parasites had fed for years and where she had scratched until she created wounds that healed poorly or not at all, the generally weakened constitution that came from chronic discomfort and inflammation and probably some level of ongoing blood loss to the parasites that had been feeding on her continuously. The attendants who prepared her body for burial reported being shocked by the extent of the damage when they finally removed her clothing and saw what years of accumulated filth and infestation had done to someone who should have been in the prime of life, and they had to cut away much of the matted hair just to be able to clean the body properly for the funeral. The English court remembered her primarily as a cautionary tale about the dangers of refusing to adapt to local customs when living in foreign territory, using her story for generations afterward as an example of how cultural stubbornness could destroy someone regardless of their high birth or political importance. The French court, when they learned the details of her death and the condition of her body, preferred to remember her as something of a martyr who had maintained her French identity and French customs in hostile English territory, even though this memory was somewhat complicated by the fact that her specific insistence on not removing body hair had been largely her own interpretation of French customs rather than something that was universal practice even in France, and that other French noble women who married into foreign royal families managed to adapt their grooming practices without feeling like they were betraying their heritage. The political consequences of Isabel's disastrous queenship lasted considerably longer than her short life, contributing to the deteriorating relationship between England and France that would eventually lead to renewed warfare and centuries of conflict, and providing convenient ammunition for English nobles and commoners who argued that French alliances were fundamentally unreliable because French people were too stubborn and too convinced of their own cultural superiority to make the practical compromises and adaptations that any reasonable person would accept when living in foreign circumstances. Modern historians looking back at Isabel's story from the perspective of centuries of distance struggle with how to interpret and contextualize her choices, because on one hand she was undeniably a young woman in an extremely difficult position, married off as a child for political reasons, sent to live in a foreign country where she had no family support and where the customs were genuinely different from what she had been raised with, trying to maintain some sense of her original identity and some connection to her French heritage in circumstances where almost everything around her was English and foreign. But on the other hand, her specific choices about grooming and hygiene were so clearly self-destructive and the solutions were so obvious and so easily available that it becomes very difficult to see her decisions as anything other than stubborn irrationality that caused completely unnecessary suffering for herself and unnecessary complications for everyone around her who had to deal with the consequences of her refusal to compromise. The fact that she could have prevented literally all of her problems by simply allowing her attendants to trim her body hair and by maintaining basic cleanliness that any person of her era and status would have been capable of makes her story particularly frustrating from a historical perspective, because unlike so many historical tragedies where the protagonists genuinely had no good options available and were trapped by circumstances beyond their control, Isabel had a very clear and very obvious solution sitting right in front of her that she simply refused to accept because she had somehow convinced herself that her body hair was inextricably tied to her dignity and her French identity in ways that made any compromise literally impossible even when the alternative was physical suffering and political disaster.